Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, January 20th, and we have a national title today. So I thought today would be a great chance to just review the entire season. We'll go through week 0 through 7 in the first segment, then we'll get through week through 8 to the conference championships in the second segment, and then we'll do a little CFP and review. So we'll just give you guys an idea of how we got here, how we got to these final two teams, and it was a very, very weird season. As you can all remember, we'll fly through that in the first couple of segments. Then we'll get to the national title warriors that have kind of developed over the last couple of years. A lot of blowouts in the past couple of national championships, especially in the CFP era, and definitely want to address that and see why the future might be just a little bit different around that. And then we'll do a little bit of a weekend catch up with a lot of the different news that has happened this weekend, including that Xavier Lucas situation between Wisconsin and Miami. That is a very interesting one to follow. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have fun back and forth. But we got to jump in because there's a lot of different stuff to talk about. With the season highlights, we'll go week by week and kind of break down the season and how it unfolded and all the different twists and turns around it, and we won't be able to get to everything. I'll just tell you that off the bat. There's a lot of stuff that has happened that we won't quite have the chance to really get into, but let's start with the first 7 weeks and get into the big-time highlights thus far. And in week one of the big-time ones was Florida State was already 0-2. By the time week 1 ended, they had fell to Georgia Tech in Ireland. They had fell to Boston College at home, and everyone was asking a lot of different questions. And their season didn't get better from there. They obviously ended 2-10, so that's the last time we'll talk about Florida State on here. But obviously, those first 2 losses were quite the story when they did happen. Then Georgia handled Clemson in that opener, obviously asserted themselves in the second half, and the questions about Dabo got very, very loud very quickly, and it sounds like he heard some of them because he got into the portal this offseason, and we'll see how that develops into 2025. Miami rolls into Florida and just dominates Florida in Gainesville. Cam Ward, kind of the legend, begins. He makes that ridiculous throw to Jacoby George for a touchdown, and the Fire Billy Napier crowd gets very, very loud. Later in the year, obviously, they would get very, very quiet, and we'll talk about that in the second segment. Then you do have that USC-LSU game, maybe the catch of the year still, and Kyron Hudson making that play. Remarkable play by him. I think there's a lot of different nominees, but that might be the number one for catch of the year. And Miller Moss and USC looked like a very dangerous team after that week 1 game. And then obviously Notre Dame gets the win of the weekend, going over to A&M and getting that big time win. And a lot of people looked at Notre Dame as a team that could possibly find their way where they are now. And then it all came crashing down in week 2. Now, to start week 2, the big-time story was Texas just buried Michigan and Ann Arbor. Probably the most complete game that Texas played. This Quinn Ewers Heisman talk was going crazy after this game, and everyone was wondering, is this a national title level team? You also had Oregon and Penn State kind of avoid scares against Boise State and Bowling Green. Obviously, Ashton Jeanty, the legend, really began. Obviously, in week 1, had an incredible game against Georgia Southern, but really in that Oregon game, everyone really started to take notice and said, this might just be a Heisman candidate regardless of where he plays. Then you did have Tennessee-NC State, which looked like a huge game at the time. Tennessee absolutely rolls NC State in that game and really looks like an offense that's just going to be entirely impossible to stop, to be totally honest. It was a crazy week 2, and that was one of the big time stories, is Tennessee's offense just one of the best, maybe the best in the country. And then you obviously had the upset of the year. NIU did it. Thomas Hammock became a fan favorite for quite some time, and Notre Dame's season was put on thin ice right after it was put on maybe the biggest pedestal of the entire week the week before. So a crazy week 2 that led way to a Notre Dame comeback that is going to culminate in tonight's game. Then you got week 3, and ASU Texas State ended up being a massive result. ASU gets the win in San Marcos by 3 points, and Cam Scadaboo really carried that team per usual in that game. It was very, very incredible, and if they don't get that win, it's a very different conversation when you talk about the Big 12 and the CFP at the end of the day. Then you did have Georgia survive at Kentucky, who only scores 13 points, wins by 1 point because maybe a questionable punt by Mark Stoops late in that game, but at the end of the day, he did learn from that, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But South Carolina LSU was another one that really stole a lot of people's eyes. A lot of people wonder, did the refs kind of rob South Carolina in that game? Obviously, the call on Kyle Kennard was questionable at best. And then the other thing was Arch Manning took over for Quinn Ewers, who went down in the UTSA game. He scores 2 touchdowns in 3 plays, and everyone becomes enamored of what the idea of Arch Manning would be, and it did not stop the rest of the season. Moving forward to week 4, you did have Tennessee get that big-time win in Norman, Oklahoma. Obviously, a game that they won kind of defensively, 25-15. Michael Hawkins came in late in that game for Oklahoma, so that's kind of when that change really started. And you saw the offense kind of start to click with Michael Hawkins in there, but Tennessee was plenty enough to win that game, continued moving on their way, and started that season really, really strong, looking like one of the best teams in the country. USC fell to Michigan in Ann Arbor, and Michigan looked like a team that was still in the top 15, still looked like a team that could very much compete for the CFP. Obviously, that did not end up happening, but USC came crashing down to earth and really did not get themselves back up throughout the season. Made a couple of big-time games, but nothing really that totally changed the season. This was kind of the death march that they started at the very end, and Michigan kind of began that for them. BYU kind of really got their hype beginning in week 4 when they beat Kansas State 38-9. Tons of turnovers for Kansas State, a kick return for BYU, a lot of hype around that team coming out of it, a lot of hype around Jake Retzlaff coming out of that game. You also had Utah get what seemingly looked like a huge win over Oklahoma State in week 4. It looked like a massive one. Isaac Wilson made a number of plays in. It looked like Cam Rising might have been coming back to that team. It looked like they might have been moving forward and feeling really confident about their chances in the Big 12. Obviously, Oklahoma State did not end up winning a conference game, and Utah looks back on that one as maybe not as pretty as it looked at the time. Definitely one that really thought was going to be a defining one in the Big 12. Ended up not mattering at all, really. Then in week 5, we had one of the games of the year, and you can argue back and forth about which one is the game of the year, but in Tuscaloosa, obviously Alabama and Georgia go back and forth, 28-0, 30-7 Bama, then 34-33 UGA, and then the play of the year by Ryan Williams at the very end of that one, the one that really still boggles my mind in every possible way. We also had Kentucky take down Ole Miss and Oxford in this one. The Kentucky defense was an absolute problem. Berrien Brown makes that huge play over the field, and that's where Mark Stoops kind of learned from that UGA lesson. He said, I'm going to take care of this ball. I'm going to keep the ball in my hands, and Berrien Brown made a huge play when they very much needed it. Totally changed Ole Miss's season. If Ole Miss wins this game, they are firmly in the playoff, and we're having a very different conversation right now when you talk about the SEC versus the Big Ten. But obviously, they fall in that game and totally changes the way they go about the rest of their business. Notre Dame survives kind of a bizarre game over Louisville in this week, one that had turnovers on both sides. Notre Dame was able to survive with their run game, but a very, very weird one in a line of very weird games for Louisville in this kind of stretch of the season. And then you'd have that Miami-Virginia Tech controversy. Miami gets the win. Virginia Tech comes a couple inches away from probably the biggest upset, or not the biggest upset, but definitely the biggest upset in the ACC thus far, and definitely would have flipped the ACC race in a number of different ways, would have put Miami in a very different standing as you headed on the rest of the season, but they win that game by the skin of their teeth, and they move on to the next week with a lot of questions about the refs in that one. To move forward to week 6, that's when Vandy and Diego Pavia really took the world by storm. They beat Alabama in Nashville, and a lot of people wonder what's happening with Kalen DeBoer. You know, is he the guy going forward? People question his outfits for some reason, but at the end of the day, he found his way through, did not necessarily have the season that he wanted, and this was a big-time reason for that. Arkansas also got Tennessee on this day. Malachi Singleton and Braylon Russell really come into that game and kind of take over for Arkansas in a lot of different ways. A huge game for them, and a lot of questions around this Tennessee offense, especially Nico Iamaleava, kind of formed from that game. Miami survives again in week 6. They find a way to get through Cal. Fernando Mendoza really catches eyes in this game, and Miami gets another questionable, at the very least, late call that gets them a win there, and definitely a great comeback from Cam Ward in that game. And then SMU and Louisville, very incredible game, back and forth one that really put SMU firmly in the ACC mix, really gave them a huge threat for possibly taking that conference, and obviously they found their way to the ACC championship. This was a huge game in that path to get there. And then in week 7, Texas wins the Red River Showdown. Definitely a game that they just kind of handle business. 34-3 pretty much start to finish. Quinn Ewers makes his return in this game and plays pretty well. Looks a little bit shaky at times with that injury, but plays overall relatively well, and it made way for a crazy game the next week. And then Penn State survives against USC in overtime. This was a huge game for Penn State. This was one they were down 14 at halftime, found their way back into this game, won it in overtime, and it was a saving grace for them throughout this season. Ohio State and Oregon obviously play that classic up there in Eugene. The Will Howard mistake that was heard around the world. He played some great football, but obviously that last one made the difference and really ignited a lot under that kid and definitely made him the player that we see before us right now. And then LSU got the win over Ole Miss in overtime and officially put Ole Miss on life support for the season, put LSU in a really good position and maybe in a position to possibly win the SEC going forward after that win. Definitely put them near the top of that conference heading into a huge matchup against A&M in a couple of weeks. But we'll talk about that in the next segment. But on top of all of that, you had Colorado start their season really, really strong, including a Hail Mary over Baylor. We had the Big 12 set up for an insane finish. Pitt, Iowa State, BYU were all undefeated, and the Group of 5 race was shaping up to be one of the weirdest that we've seen in quite some time. So it was an incredible start to the season. We had a couple of upsets in Vanderbilt and NIU that really set the world on fire. We had a number of teams that we wondered if anyone was elite in any sense of the word, and we wondered if anyone was going to be able to make it out of the season undefeated. Obviously, no one did. Well, someone made it out of the regular season undefeated, but at the end of the day, it was a remarkable start to this season and definitely set us up for a crazy, crazy second half. I mean, you talk about the 2 games of the year with Tuscaloosa in Alabama, Georgia, as well as Oregon, Ohio State, 2 games that really defined this season, and then the upsets just came all over the place. We had a number of teams really come up to the top of the fray, especially BYU, Iowa State, and a couple other teams. Pitt was one of those teams where you're looking at the second half of the season, you were saying they win one of these big-time games, they are firmly in the mix. Obviously, they would not win another game the rest of the season, so they'd be in a really weird spot, but definitely set us up for a crazy back half, and that's exactly what we'll talk about. Right after this break, we'll get into weeks 8 through the conference championships, break down everything that happened till then, and the race to the CFP that got absolutely crazy and had a number of twists and turns, and we'll break it all down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about week 0 through week 7. A ton of craziness, a lot of upsets, 2 games of the year depending on the way you look at it. You can choose Oregon, Ohio State, you can choose Alabama, Georgia. Both of them were absolutely incredible, but now we got to make way for the home stretch. The stretch of all the craziness that really unfolded and a number of different things that really happened in this that were upsets, were teams kind of coming into the fray at the last moment, the Big 12 craziness, and everything in between happened in these weeks 8 through the conference championship week, and we'll start with that week 8, and it started with a kick. We had BYU survive against Oklahoma State, a huge comeback for them, kept the undefeated season alive. That last second catch by Kamari Lassiter was the difference in this game. Remarkable, or Darius Lassiter. Remarkable game from BYU, and they became a real contender. They looked like a team that was just never going to die. They were never going to get beat throughout this year, and they were going to roll to the Big 12 championship. Obviously, that didn't unfold, but definitely looked like a team that was just going to be really hard to stop right around then. Then you'd have Georgia just roll over Texas. They sacked Quinn Ewers 7 times. A lot of different questions around Texas in that kind of welcome to the SEC moment type of a game where everything was not working for them. The defense played pretty good football, but gave up 30 points because they were put in bad situation after bad situation, and a lot of questions around Texas really started to arise around that game. Then you had Miami survive yet again. You had Miami against Louisville, a really crazy game. Cam Ward kind of took control of the Heisman race in this game, put up crazy numbers as he did really throughout the entirety of the year for the most part, but definitely really took control of that Heisman race during this game. Obviously would lose it a little bit to that Travis Hunter guy, but at the end of the day, remarkable season, and this was one of those games. And then Tennessee got the win over Bama the second time they beat them in a row in Knoxville, and very different game than the first time around, but a couple of huge plays from Nico Iamaleava, especially that, including that back end with Jermod McCoy, was the difference in this game. Played some really great football and definitely put them in the driver's seat for a possible CFP spot down the stretch. Then in Week 9, we had Penn State win with their backup. That's when kind of the Bo Parabola talk really started, when a lot of people really caught his eye, and a lot of people started probably looking at him for a possible transfer portal spot, and Missouri ended up winning out there. But that Jalen Reed pick could be the turning point of the entire season for Penn State, because you look back on the what the offense was doing before that, they were all over the place, but it gave them the spark they very badly needed and really set them up for a great finish to the season. Obviously, had that bump in the road against Ohio State, but you lose this game and then the Ohio State game, you might be in a position where you don't even make the CFP at the end of the year. Texas survived Vandy in this week after that Georgia loss. Definitely was up against the ropes at different points against this Vandy team, but Quinn Ewers started to find his stride in the second half of this game. They made some big time plays and they got the win over Vanderbilt by 3 points. A&M beats LSU to kind of take control of the SEC for a time. Marcel Reed steps in for Connor Wegman in this game and totally takes over. Big time comeback for A&M, moves them to 7-1 overall. 5-0 in the conference, and puts them on top of the SEC. And a lot of people are wondering, is this going to be the team that finds their way into the CFP this year? It kind of fell apart from there for the Aggies, but we'll talk about that obviously. And then Notre Dame kind of ruined the fun for Navy. 6 fumbles, a ton of mistakes for Navy, and Notre Dame took full advantage, kind of kept their dream alive for the CFP, and obviously buried the little chance that Navy did have to possibly make a run at the CFP. Then you had Week 10, and this one was a very weird one. You had Georgia against Florida, and DJ Lagway threw an incredible touchdown pass to open this game to Aiden Mizell, and then he went down. And a lot of people wonder, if he doesn't go down, does Florida possibly win that game? But Georgia came up with enough plays. They found a way to win that game 34-20. A lot of people wondered, what's happening with Georgia? Is this just who they are this season? Are they just not a team that is really ever going to find their stride throughout this year? Or is there going to be a moment where they really flip that switch? They sort of did, but never really quite did, at least overall throughout this season. You also had Ohio State finish off Penn State. They won 20-13 in this one. Penn State goes up 10 to start this game, much like that Notre Dame game that we'll talk about in the next segment. But a lot of really incredible stuff from Ohio State in this one, and the O-line really got a ton of confidence in that last drive where they went about 5.5 minutes, never gave the ball back, ran the ball down Penn State's throat, and you're looking up at the end of the game, and Ohio State has not a comfortable win, but a win nonetheless, and they move forward with a lot of momentum towards the end of the season. South Carolina just rolls A&M in here in Week 10, and the A&M reign over the SEC was very short-lived. South Carolina really tore through the Aggies. Lenore Sellers became a huge name on the market, as did a lot of guys on that South Carolina team. The offense really started to hit their stride, and as you know by now, it carried throughout the rest of the season. Not quite into bowl season, though, against Illinois. Then you did have the Big 12 bomb that went off. You had Houston beat Kansas State, you had Texas Tech beat Iowa State, and you had a lot of things just start to begin in the Big 12. The chaos was just getting underway, and we'll talk about Kansas here in a second because they started their death march just about in the next week. And then Clemson against Louisville was a big-time question question mark. Clemson loses in pretty dominating fashion in a lot of ways for Louisville, and a lot of people have some questions about what Clemson is going to be this year and what they're going to be going forward with a lot of different things going on in that program. Obviously, they were able to find their footing in a lot of different ways, but definitely put them behind the eight ball in the ACC for the time being. Then you had Week 11, and Ole Miss was able to handle Georgia in this week. This was the one where you really felt like Georgia was just not the normal team that they used to be. Georgia falls behind Bama, behind Texas, behind Ole Miss, and a lot of other teams in the SEC, and it looks like they are not on their way to Atlanta. Obviously, craziness would happen after that, but then you did have Miami fall to Georgia Tech. They finally get got by someone. A remarkable game called by Tyler Santucci. The offense for Miami looked a little bit all over the place in that game, and Georgia Tech was able to get that win with just a couple of big-time plays from Jamal Haynes and Haynes King. And then Alabama just buries LSU in Death Valley, totally tore them to pieces. Jalen Milroe has probably his second-best game of the year, although that Georgia game did get a little sketchy in the second half, so maybe this is his best game of the year. But overall, really remarkable game from him. Definitely put LSU in a really bad spot and put them in a spot where they had to win out and get a little bit of help to find their way into the CFP. Then you had the Kansas Death March begin. In Week 11, they started their Death March by beating Iowa State. Then they rattle off wins over Colorado and KSU over the next couple of weeks, and everyone was wondering, what is the Big 12 going to look like after all of this? Because as of right then, it looked like there was no one that was going to make the Big 12 championship. It looked like it was going to be a 10-way tie, and we were going to have to find some way, a coin flip, find a way to get someone into that championship game. So, remarkable job from Kansas down the stretch of the season. Remarkable job from Lance Leipold and his staff, but definitely created a craziness in the Big 12, and a lot of people had a lot of questions after those games that happened. Then in Week 12, we had Oregon just totally escape Madison, had 8 games in a row leading up to this one, finally was able to look a little bit worse for the wear, but was able to get the win 16-13. The defense played incredibly well in that game. Oregon almost gives it away with a little bit of a risky play by Dan Lanning late in that game to not take the field goal, but at the end of the day, Oregon gets the win, continues to stay undefeated, and was able to carry that the rest of the way. Then you did have Georgia kind of handle Tennessee. After that Ole Miss game, a lot of different questions. This was really when Carson Beck's season kind of turned around. He had a really good game, did not have any picks, and would not have any picks for the rest of the season. So played really good football down the stretch, and this is really when it really started. Obviously, Miami fans are hoping his season looks a little bit more like those last 4 games, in the middle 4 games, if you're talking about what he's going to do at Miami. And then you did have Florida kind of ruin LSU's dream. They went in there knowing they had to win out. DJ Lagway kind of became a legend. This was after that Texas game where they kind of mainly held him out in some ways because they knew the next 2 games were so important. Also the game that in some ways saved Billy Napier's job, and then in some ways it was the next week, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And then Arizona State beat Kansas State, put them at the very top of the Big 12, and definitely took control of the Big 12 after this moment, put them in a position where if they win out, they're in a very good spot, and then it led to a crazy game the very next week. And it started with Ohio State beating Indiana. Indiana definitely put up a fight in the first half of this one, played really physically, but at the end of the day, Ohio State was just a little bit too much for the Hoosiers and definitely ended that undefeated season. Obviously, Indiana was able to rebound, make it into the CFP, but definitely put them in a very weird spot, especially going into some of those last couple of games. Obviously had Purdue, so I wasn't too worried, but definitely put a little bit of a question mark around them for the CFP. Then you had the Arizona State BYU just debacle that happened in the end of that game. ASU and Kenny Dillingham almost hand the game and maybe the Big 12 to BYU at the very end of this one. The fans rushed the field twice. It was madness. That was a couple of times, different times that happened throughout the year, but this was obviously a crazy one and definitely put them in a really weird spot. Auburn hands A&M their 3rd loss of the season at that point, and in 4 overtimes. It was a crazy game. Amari Daniels has a drop at the very end of that one and gives a ton of opening to some others in the SEC, including the team they were going to play the very next week in Texas. Then you did have Colorado's Big 12 chances kind of fall apart this week. This was when Kansas really put them in a tough spot. Definitely got that win and ran all over this Colorado team. And a lot of the worries that we had about Colorado going into the season were finally realized in this game and definitely put them behind the 8 ball in a Big 12 that was setting up for the craziest finish you had ever seen. And then you do have Ole Miss, another victim to the swamp. Florida gets another one, and officially Billy Napier's job is finally safe for the season. Ole Miss's CFP berth chances just fall off a cliff in this game, and they win this one. Again, another team that gets in, and another team that I'd be watching very closely if they were to get into the CFP. Then in the last week of the season, including the conference championships, you did have Georgia Tech, 8 overtimes. Remarkable game on that Friday night. Georgia was able to walk away with a win. Definitely a very scary one, and would have put a real world where the SEC only got one team into the CFP. Obviously, that did not end up happening. Tennessee was able to take care of business against Vanderbilt. They were able to move forward, and 3 of them got in, but definitely put that in a very big question. Texas wins the Lone Star Showdown for the first time in 13 years. Definitely a great thing to see that game played again, and Texas with a big-time goal line stand gets the win there. Miami falls out of the ACC championship. Clemson falls into it with a loss, but Syracuse, and Fran Brown gave Clemson a spot in the ACC championship, even though they lost to South Carolina in pretty dramatic fashion, with Lenora Sellers getting a big-time win there, having a remarkable run at the end of that game to get the win. But Clemson finds their way into the ACC. They obviously win that one, move on to the CFP, but then you had Michigan kind of quote-unquote ruin Ohio State's season in a lot of ways. People were wondering if it was the 4th straight year. Was Ryan Day going to be fired even before the CFP, or especially if they lost in the CFP? Was he going to be fired? So a million things came out of this one. Obviously, a lot of that stuff has been quieted right now, but we'll start back up pretty shortly here after the season ends. But then you had conference championship week. You had Georgia beat Texas again. You had Oregon win a shootout over Penn State. Clemson held off SMU on a comeback, and then Arizona State just buried Iowa State, and Boise State punched their ticket officially over UNLV. So the end of the regular season left many more questions than answers. There's no doubt about that. Is Ryan Day done at Ohio State? Who is deserving of being in the CFP? Is that 3-loss SEC team or a 2-loss ACC team? Is it Ashton Genty or is it Travis Hunter for the Heisman? And most of all, how does this thing end? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next segment. We'll get into the CFP breakdown, all of the games, all the craziness that unfolded, and we'll obviously give a couple of final thoughts on that national title game right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about just a review of the entirety of the regular season. Got through the first 7 weeks in the first segment, then got through the rest of it in this last segment, and a lot of stuff. There's no doubt about that. It was a crazy regular season, but then it made way for that CFP to get underway, and really the bowl season as well, that really kind of informed a lot of the narratives that we heard throughout the CFP. So let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about what the CFP held. We'll obviously be able to slow down just a little bit in this segment compared to the last couple, because we have a little bit less to talk about, let's say. But definitely let's jump in and let's get into those first round games. Notre Dame gets a big-time win, 27-17 over Indiana. It ended up being a 10-point win, but anyone that was watching this game know that Notre Dame pretty much dominated this one, especially their defense. Really, both defenses dominated this one in a lot of ways. That Jeremiah Love run was the difference maker in this one in a lot of ways. Definitely put Notre Dame on a very good track, but Notre Dame dominated in the trenches defensively. They struggled offensively and definitely added a lot of questions about what the future, the next game against Georgia held, what Penn State possibly held, and definitely put them in question of, is this offense going to be able to elevate the way that they need to in the right moments throughout this thing? Obviously made enough plays in this game, but definitely were some questions with how that, especially that offensive line, worked against that Indiana defensive line. They had some really good success and definitely put a little bit of a question of how they would handle Georgia on the line there. But then we move forward. We did have the probably the closest game of the first round games. Clemson, powered by just an insane performance from Cade Klubnik, what might have been one of the best performances of the entire thing, if I'm being totally honest, but he pulled within 7 in the fourth quarter. Texas returned the favor with a 77-yard touchdown from Jaden Blue, and that thing was kind of over pretty much right then. Obviously, the Texas defense played a huge role in this game, got a couple of different times, and people were wondering, is that going to be something that a team down the road, whether it was Oregon, Ohio State, or maybe even Arizona State, could really exploit on that back end? Didn't necessarily end up happening. Obviously, it was kind of a one-off with TJ Moore just going crazy in that game, but remarkable finish from Texas there. They move on to the quarters that made way for what was really, really a remarkable game that we'll talk about here in a second. Then we did have Penn State just dominate SMU from start to finish, and we'll talk about the narratives here in a second that came out of that one, but really controlled the pace of this game, dominated the line of scrimmage, got 2 pick sixes from their linebackers to start this one, and a lot of people, had some questions about how much the cold really affected this one. I think it really did. Penn State did not look like a team that could really pass the ball very effectively, and obviously that added to the questions of what the future held for this season for the CFP for Penn State, but overall, real domination from Penn State in this one. Definitely put them on an inside track for a semifinal game because they had a good draw against Boise State for the next round, so they felt very good coming out of this one. A whiteout in Happy Valley, and it was a very, very fun one to watch unfold, I can tell you that. Then you had Ohio State just handle Tennessee and shut everyone up, including myself. I picked Tennessee to win that game. They did not win that game by any means. Will Howard threw for over 300 yards. Jeremiah Smith dominated from start to finish, and Ohio State looked like the team that we'd kind of been waiting on. The team that looked like a $20 million team, the team that looked like the one that was going to pull away with the national title. That's what we were waiting for. That was the team that we were waiting for, and that was kind of the Ryan Day that we were waiting for in a lot of different ways, and we've seen it kind of carry out throughout the rest of the CFP. But the narratives coming out of this one, as you have to imagine, the SEC fans had a little bit of a field day. They said Indiana, they said SMU didn't belong by any means. They said that Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, what have you, absolutely should have been in the mix. They got quiet very quickly shortly after this because the bowl games had not unfolded before these games. Obviously, they would have, but by the time the quarterfinals happened, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But also, anti-expansionists did a lot with this, said that 12 teams is way too much. I would very much argue there weren't 12 CFP-worthy teams. I'd argue there won't be in many seasons. But at the end of the day, the home environments really won some people over and made a really fun week out of some not-so-fun games, really. Nonetheless, it made some really, really great atmospheres, and I don't know about y'all, but I had a great time watching these games unfold. It was really incredible to see what happened here, and definitely those home environments are something that we'll talk about a little bit later in the week. Could be something that's coming a little bit more frequently to the CFP as we move forward, but definitely an incredible first round. The other part was, home games really became a fan favorite, and people were wondering, should we have them in the quarterfinals? But in the quarterfinals, we did have a lot of bowl games, and we had some really good ones. It started with Penn State and Boise State, and this one was interesting. It was a very fun game really late into it. Boise State pulled within 3 after a huge play from Matt Lauder down the sideline. But the running back duo of Katron Allen and Nick Singleton was just way too much. Some huge throws from Drew Aller to start this one, but looked a little bit shaky throughout this one, at least consistently. And the Ashton Genty race to history fell just short of Barry Sanders in that one. But remarkable game. Definitely put Penn State in a really good place going forward. And definitely some questions still lingered about that offensive passing game, but looked a little bit more solid than it did against SMU and put them in a better place as they move forward to play Notre Dame. Then you had Texas just escape 39-31 against Arizona State in double overtime. To me, so far, this is the game of the CFP. Now, we have a couple in the next round that really give it a good run for their money, but this one was absolutely wild. Texas was up 14 at halftime. Cam Scadaboo plays maybe the best performance of the entire CFP thus far. Comes back in the second half. Texas hits the 4th and 13 in the first overtime, and Andrew Makuba gets the INT to seal it. This one was insane. It was all over the place, a couple of insane plays, but Quinn Ewers takes over late in that game. Texas gets the big-time win, and they move on to play that Ohio State team that was already taking a buzzsaw to Oregon. That game wasn't even over, and Ohio State was already up on Oregon. They did not stop. They got up 34-0 in this game. Jeremiah Smith and just about everyone else on that team had a field day. They had, I believe, 4 different touchdowns, over 40 yards, and Ohio State looked like the obvious team that was going to win the national title after this week. Did not look like any of the teams around them had much of a shot if they were going to play that level of football. Then you did have Notre Dame get that big time win over Georgia, 23-13. Georgia, led by Gunnar Stockton, missed chance after chance in this game. Gunnar Stockton was not remotely the reason that Georgia lost this game. Some pocket mobility issues, some awareness issues that definitely were a problem, some sideline awareness issues that were a big-time problem in this game, but remarkable coaching from Marcus Freeman, a really good play from that Notre Dame defense, and a couple of big-time plays from Riley Leonard with his legs were the difference in this one, and Notre Dame moved on to play Penn State in the Orange Bowl, put them in a really good place to move forward to that possible national title, and a lot of the narratives came crashing back down to earth. By this time, Alabama had lost. By this time, a lot of teams at South Carolina had lost. Ole Miss was coming up the next day, and people were kind of hoping they would lose. But at the end of the day, the narrative flipped very, very quickly, and a lot of people were talking about the Big Ten, obviously, as the best conference in the country. 2 teams in the semifinals. SEC only had 1. It was the new team, Texas, and some people had a field day with that one, going back the other direction at some SEC fans. Obviously, a normal thing to do in the world of college football, so not necessarily overly surprised by that one, but the quarterfinal games were really fun. Boise State put up a really good fight, definitely proved that they belong. You also had Arizona State absolutely proved they belong, definitely put Texas in a very weird spot, and added a lot of questions about what that Texas team really could do, especially running the football against an Ohio State team that was looking like a buzzsaw at this point. Was looking like a team that if they played that level of football, none of these games were going to be close. They were going to be able to pull away, but Notre Dame looked like a team that they were just never going to go away. They were going to play really, really efficient, really clean football throughout these games, and they were just going to wait for you to make the mistake. They were going to take advantage, and that's exactly what they did against Penn State. And moving forward to those semifinal games, Notre Dame gets a dramatic win over Penn State, 27-24, and this was one there Penn State's going to be remembering for a long time. 10-point lead early in this one. Notre Dame gets a huge middle eight where they get the 3 points right before halftime with Steve Angeli coming in, get the touchdown right out of it, tie it, and then take the lead pretty much shortly after, go up 17-0, and then Penn State marched right back down, tied the game, got an immediate INT, got ahead again by 24-17, and then Jaden Greathouse returned the favor. So it was a little bit of a duel in the second half of this game, went back and forth, but was an incredible game from both teams. Drew Aller made the ultimate mistake. He made the mistake that really stopped the stalemate. Christian Gray makes a great play on the ball, and Mitch Jeter officially hits the game winner. Notre Dame moves on to the national title for the first time since 2012, and obviously seeking their first national title tonight and since 1988. So a lot of different things went into this game. Remarkable second half from both these teams, but Notre Dame made those couple of plays at the end the way they had really throughout this entire tournament. Then you did have Ohio State get the big-time win over Texas. This was a 14-point win, but it was not a 14-point win. It was a very, very sketchy one. Ohio State stops Texas, scores immediately, and it looks like Ohio State might be able to pull away with this game. But then Texas was able to settle in, return the favor, and then the TreVeyon Henderson play happened. So the 2 big plays in this game were the TreVeyon Henderson play as well as the Jack Sawyer return. If the TreVeyon Henderson play doesn't happen, Texas kicking a field goal on that fourth down. The Jack Sawyer play never happens, and you look forward and you're wondering, I don't know what happens as you move forward. Maybe Texas ends up winning that game 17-14, and you're looking at an entirely different national championship. But remarkable performance from those 2 guys. The last time Ohio State and Notre Dame faced each other in a national title, I have no idea, Anthony. I'll be totally honest. I do not know. I think it was somewhere back in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like I've heard that this week, but I genuinely don't know. And definitely would be a very interesting thing to figure out. And obviously will be something that they'll talk about on today's game. Maybe they haven't played at all on this stage. Who knows? But let's talk about it. The national championship going on tonight, there were 2 teams left. That was about it, and the way this year started, it looked like there were about 4 teams that could win a national title. It looked like there were 4 teams that were far and above the mix, and it was Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, and Georgia. One of the teams is still standing. Ohio State is still standing here. Was a very, very weird road to get here. Obviously lost that Oregon game, a lot of questions. Obviously lost that Michigan game, and a million questions really came from it. Notre Dame obviously had that NIU loss and had to earn the respect back of a lot of people, including myself, throughout the back half of that season. Did that and then some. Did some really, really incredible play, and honestly, Anthony, I think you might be right. I think a lot of people are looking at this game and saying Ohio State's going to roll. Ohio State has more talent. Ohio State is rolling downhill right now, but you look at what Notre Dame can do. It is very, very hard to blow out this team. It's very, very hard to even beat this team by multiple scores, if I'm being totally honest. They're a very, very efficient, very good team, and they're a team that can keep everything in front of them. Now, we will have some questions about that man coverage that we've been talking about quite a bit on here, Anthony, and it sounds like Al Golden is more than happy to move forward with that cover one concept where he plays Xavier Watts deep, lets his guys play man coverage, drops a couple of linebackers in coverage, but overall, it's going to be man coverage, and that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that, but yeah, I think it's safe to say this Notre Dame defense might be the best that they've faced all year. I think that Texas defense is right around that level, but you saw what Ohio State had to do to get their offense going in that game, and you saw how close that game ended up being. So it's going to be an incredible one, and Notre Dame is going to do everything in their power to stay in this one, and obviously everything in their power to try to find a way to get those couple of plays that they've been able to get against Georgia, against Indiana, and against Penn State. They'll try to get them tonight, and we'll see what happens. But overall, obviously the coaching edge I have given to Notre Dame in this game, but it's a very slight one. It'll be incredible to watch that one unfold, and let's talk about that national title just a little bit and some of the worries that we have around it, some of the worries that it might just be a blowout and how the past kind of upholds that, and we'll talk about why I think this game and the future is going to be a little bit different right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the CFP in review, just kind of went through all of the games that have already unfolded. Definitely a lot of craziness in that one, especially that Texas-Arizona State game and then those semifinal games. Definitely kept us on our toes, but we have two teams left, and that brings us to a little bit of a trend that has unfolded throughout the CFP, which is just blowouts in these title games. You know, you have two teams that seem to be relatively evenly matched, and then they officially get on the field, and one team just rolls the other. And it's been varying degrees throughout this thing. Obviously, we had a 3-year run that was absolutely incredible in this thing, but at the end of the day, been a lot of different blowouts, a lot of different games decided by more than 2 scores, and there's really only been 3 that have been decided by less than 2 scores. So let's get into all the games that have happened in the CFP thus far, and then we'll get into why I think this year and the next couple of years will be a little bit different when we talk about that. But let's start with the ones that have already unfolded in the CFP. It obviously started with Ohio State winning the first 4 team. They could obviously win the first 12 team today. Would be quite the storyline, no doubt about that. And it was Ezekiel Elliott, it was Cardale Jones that really stole the show. It was obviously an incredible game against Alabama that really got this thing kicked off. And then they were able to handle business against an Oregon team that was a ton of fun. That was definitely a team that was very dangerous. Ohio State was able to do it, and Cardale Jones became a legend around Columbus, Ohio for a very, very long time. Then we had the 3-year run that everyone wishes would come back, and I think might just come back in a couple of years here, but Clemson, Alabama had a number of battles throughout those years. They had the back-to-back ones, and it was a crazy couple of games. You had Alabama get that 5-point win against Clemson in the first one. Remarkable game. Derrick Henry kind of just ran all over him. Jake Coker led them to that national championship over Deshaun Watson for Clemson. Then the next year, you had Hunter Renfrow make the play of maybe Clemson history, frankly, against Alabama, the walk-off touchdown that every Alabama fan will tell you was a pick play to this day. I might just tell you the same thing. But at the end of the day, it was an incredible battle. It was Jalen Hurts' first year at Alabama, so fell a little bit short there, didn't play the greatest game, and it made way for what was the weirdest championship game that I can remember. If I'm being totally honest, this was the Tua game. Jalen Hurts struggles in the first half, throws a couple of picks. UGA looks like a team that is firmly on their way to a national title, and then Tua comes into the mix, makes a number of big-time throws. The throw to Devontae Smith that was just getting the legend started for Devontae Smith as a freshman definitely put them in a really good spot, and obviously won that game, kept the Alabama dynasty rolling, put them in an incredible position, and then they got Clemson one more time. They got Clemson in. Clemson just rolled over them. Trevor Lawrence and Trevor Etienne were incredible in that game, put them on the top of the mountaintop, obviously ended did not end Trevor Lawrence's career, but remarkable game there. Got Clemson to the top of the mountaintop for the second time over Alabama and put Dabo Swinney in some pretty rarefied air when you talk about head coaches in college football. Then you did move forward to the two buzzsaws of the CFP era, which were 2019 LSU and 2020 Bama. 2019 LSU, Clemson definitely put up a fight in that game. It was very, very close in the first half, and then Jamar Chase just tore A.J. Terrell to pieces throughout that game. Really remarkable game from LSU. Obviously finished off what could be described as the best season of a CFP team thus far. Definitely going to be really, really awesome to watch what happened in this game. And I tend to agree with you, Anthony, on the formatting issues. Definitely something that we'll talk about a little bit later in the weekend. Something that we got a little bit of news on this past weekend, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But overall, these games were incredible. You had LSU just kind of roll over their opponent, finish off what ends up being, in my opinion at least, the best CFP team we've seen thus far. They were followed right back up by the second best team we've seen thus far in the CFP era. Alabama just rolls over Ohio State the last time Ohio State was in this game, and then we had the Georgia-Alabama game. This was obviously decided by 15 points, but was a really, really fun game, back and forth, with definitely a game that, until Keely Ringo made that play, there was a lot of nervous people in Athens, Georgia, that Alabama was going to do it again, that they were going to be able to beat them for what felt like a millionth time in a row and win another national title. But Keely Ringo makes the play, puts Georgia on top of the sport, and they did not stop by any means. They move on to another national title. They beat the crap out of TCU. Obviously got that incredible game against Ohio State that kind of felt like a pseudo-national championship at the time, but at the end of the day, Georgia gets a big-time win over TCU. This is a huge, huge blowout and a huge talking point for a lot of people that kind of peddle this narrative. And then you did have Michigan get the win over Washington last year. Was a remarkable game. At the end of the day, the Michigan defense was just too much for Washington. Washington felt like they used just about all of their ability against Texas in that semifinal, where they went absolutely crazy. But at the end of the day, was a remarkable 10 seasons. Definitely had some different things, and I think when you look back at a lot of these games, you have the LSU-Clemson game, like Anthony just talked about, wasn't necessarily quite as lopsided as one seems. That Georgia-Alabama game obviously was very, very close to the very end, and then you had this 3-year run that was just downright incredible with Clemson-Alabama, and then Georgia-Alabama at the very end of it. Was a really, really good 4-team CFP era. We've moved forward to the 12-team, obviously, and the question is, will it be different going forward? Will we be able to find a couple of really good CFP championships? And I'll talk about this year first, and then we'll get into the future of the CFP and why I think it's going to at least somewhat change as we go forward. For this one tonight, 2 elite defenses. That's the main reason why this thing is going to be incredible. Notre Dame and Ohio State are top 2 defenses in the country. When you talk about points per game allowed, they have an ability to keep themselves in and give them multiple chances in this game, even against elite offenses. They will have the ability to make sure that they at least stay in this game. If one team can move the ball super consistently, I'll be surprised. And now I think Ohio State's going to make their plays. I think Notre Dame's going to make their plays. But I don't think anyone's going to have a ton of down-to-down success running the football. I don't think anyone's going to have a ton of down-to-down success really executing at a very, very high level on the offensive side of the ball. We saw the Ohio State-Texas game. It just didn't look really in sync for Ohio State in a lot of that game. Definitely was a game where that offense looked at least mortal for the first time in the CFP, and Notre Dame, as Anthony was talking about, might just have a little bit better of a defense than Texas does. Definitely a very tough battle, but 2 elite defenses, and definitely 2 defenses that can keep Ohio State at least at bay for a time being. Same thing with Ohio State, obviously. Tons of guys on that defense and playing at a ridiculously high level. Then you got some gamers at quarterback, and this cannot be overstated. These 2 guys are just winners. Will Howard has played really, really good football throughout the CFP, probably better than any other quarterback in the CFP thus far. And then Riley Leonard just makes winning plays. That's what he does. He made multiple third-down runs against UGA that put him in a great spot, a couple of great passes against Penn State that were absolutely massive, especially that one to Jaden Greathouse. And these guys just win football games. That's what they've been able to do throughout their entirety of their careers. That's what they're going to be able to do tonight, and we'll see who can end up winning out. Definitely going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And yeah, I think when you talk about, diversity in run game, both these teams do an incredible job. Chip Kelly is absolutely incredible at using motion, using wide receivers to play around with some different things. Obviously, that 3-headed monster helps them out a little bit over there at Notre Dame, but when you talk about diverse run games, these might be the two most diverse in the entire country. Really, really remarkable packages, and they do some really incredible things, and these quarterbacks are obviously at the center of it. Frankly, I do think we're going to see a little bit more of Will Howard running the football in this game. Definitely will be interesting to watch that unfold and see which one of these run games can kind of win out at the end of the day. And then Notre Dame's ability to just stay in it. They have this weird superpower, and it's hard to describe, it's hard to put a number on it or figure out just exactly why, but they have this thing that if they look up at the scoreboard and they're a little bit down or it's a really close game, they're going to make sure that it stays a really close game. They're going to make sure that they keep their foot on the gas, that they make sure that this offense does not get going when they really need to, and it goes all over the place. I think there's going to be so many different things that unfold in the last little bit, and Oregon, TCU, Washington, I think there's an argument to be made either way. I think when you look back at that 2014 season, TCU was a really, really good team. And then TCU in the 2022 season, a lot of people question, what was the Big 12 that year? Was it really all that strong? At the end of the day, I've always kind of gone with the most deserving teams should get in, and in those years, I think TCU wins a Big 12 championship, probably deserves to be in. I think Washington obviously was a really great team when they got in that 2015 year. It was a very weird year in general. So overall, I think there were a lot of people that you could definitely question as you look back, and we'll be able to do that almost a little bit more when you get into the 12-team playoff. Definitely something that we'll talk about as we get throughout the rest of the week. We'll talk about what the 12-team holds, and we'll talk about the future, what the future holds, and why I think it'll be a little bit different when we talk about the national championship. The scales are evening. I don't think there's any question about that. As we've seen throughout this year, the Big Ten and the SEC are kind of evening up at the top, with the SEC not having quite the edge that they've had the past couple of years, and then the Big 12 and the ACC are just becoming more dangerous. You look at what the ACC can be next year with Clemson and Miami and plenty more teams that are really going to be in the mix for the ACC. I think Clemson is a downright title contender as we head into 2025. I think next year could be even more parity-laden than this one was. Now, it's going to be really hard to beat that, but I do think it's going to be a little bit all over the place, and you look at what the SEC has next year, a lot of questions at quarterback for a lot of different teams, and we'll see who can find their way out of that one. Going to be an incredible, incredible year, and overall, you can see the scales kind of evening in this sport. That's going to make for some really, really incredible CFP games down the stretch. Then you have multiple postseason games to kind of quote-unquote warm up. Obviously, they're not warm-up games by any means. You got to win them. But at the end of the day, it definitely does give way for some of these semifinal, final games to be a little bit more tightly fought, because these teams have the ability to shake off some of that rust that they build up by sitting on the couch for a couple of weeks before they play those games. And then you get an ability for these games to be incredible down the stretch of the season. I think we saw it last week, but in the semifinal games, I think we saw it with Notre Dame and Penn State just going at each other, Ohio State and Texas looking like two defenses that knew exactly what they were doing at every single second. It becomes a war of attrition. The first round games are really fun with those home atmospheres, but the next couple of games really put you in a position to play your best, and then you have these incredible, incredible games going to the back end. But yeah, that's something we'll talk about later in the week, this idea around Notre Dame and what would happen if other teams go independent. Definitely something we'll talk about likely tomorrow in some detail, and then we'll get into it later in the week, look at some teams, including those those four teams right there that you just described, and we'll see what the reality of that is. I find it a little bit hard to believe for a lot of the teams out there, but definitely could happen for a couple of them, and we'll see which ones those teams are later in the week. But the final thing here is rematches are very possible in this one. We've seen it before with Alabama, Georgia, and we saw how those unfolded. Two games that are really, really incredible, two really competitive games in those championship ones. So we could very well see, Oregon, Ohio State next year, or Ohio State, Penn State, or Texas, Georgia, or Texas, Florida. Who knows what happens next year? But at the end of the day, we've had some incredible, incredible finals, and some of them have just been rematches, whether it was from the year before or from earlier in the year. And obviously with the seeding, that creates a couple of questions about when this will happen and how that will kind of unfold, but overall it definitely is something that could help out these and definitely put us in a position where we have some really incredible national championships. So overall, I think it's definitely a worry. These championship games have not been quite as fun as we want them to be over the past couple of years, and maybe tonight's the same. Maybe Ohio State goes out there and absolutely rolls Notre Dame. Maybe Notre Dame's defense is just too much for Ohio State, and it definitely puts them in a bad spot. But overall, I really do think we're turning a corner. I think in the world of college football, you're seeing a lot of different teams kind of find their way to the top, and definitely some evening of the scales happening. And then you really just see a lot of different things that are going to happen in this sport, and you see how it could tip the scales a little bit more in some of the smaller teams' favor. And it feels like we're getting there, and it feels like we're going to have some really fun championship games that follow with that. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we'll get to a little bit of a weekend catch-up, and we'll talk about all of this stuff, including auto buys, probably not changing for 2025, the Title IX questions for revenue sharing, and the Xavier Lucas saga that has been very, very interesting to watch. But we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the national title and how there's been quite a few blowouts lately. Definitely throughout the CFP stretch, we have not quite had the games that we all wanted in the national title. I feel like that's starting to change. Maybe it'll change tonight, maybe it'll change next year, but I feel like we're finding our way to some really competitive national title opportunities, as we move forward. It's going to be a really incredible thing to watch over the next couple of years. But let's get into this, Anthony. Let's talk about all the craziness that's happening around this, and we'll get into that just in a second. Actually, we'll get into Xavier Lucas, just in a second here. But let's start with the CFP auto buys. Unlikely to change. It sounds like they've met in Atlanta this past weekend. I believe yesterday is when they really met. Doesn't sound like the Big 12, the ACC, the Mountain West, and really any of the Group of 5 commissioners are on board with getting rid of the auto buys, at least as of yet. It sounds like there could be some changes coming in 2025. There could be some minor tweaks. Maybe that includes reseeding, which I think would solve some of the issues that we do have right now, at least in the short term. But it was always going to be an issue, getting the ACC, the Big 12, the Mountain West to say, yeah, we'll get rid of our auto buy, we'll get rid of the path we have to a Sugar Bowl or to a Fiesta Bowl right away. That's probably not going to happen. It probably wasn't going to happen going in. That being said, it's definitely something that could happen going into 2026 or maybe going forward, and maybe there's more conversations to be had. Maybe they'll say, we won't give you an auto buy, but we'll give you an auto home game. Maybe that's enough to kind of change things up, and we'll see what happens. Definitely some things being talked about around seeding, around the size of the tournament. It is going to grow either to 14 or 16 here coming up pretty soon, but overall, really, really interesting report, and definitely add some questions about what next year's CFP is going to look like. 2026 and going forward, that's a whole different conversation that we can have a totally different time. But this is a very, very interesting thing, and definitely makes a lot of people mad. In the SEC and the Big Ten, we'll see what they have a resolution to this, and we'll see if things change. Maybe things change and they have enough enticing things on the table for Boise State or for the Mountain West in general and the ACC and the Big 12 to come to the table and say they're more than willing to do this. But definitely something that we probably won't see in 2025, could be something we see in 2026. Title IX is expected to interfere with the revenue sharing split, and this is a big time story. This is a story that is going to totally change the way the next year or 2 years really unfold. It sounds like it should be divided proportionally between the male and female athletes. whatever that means. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch this unfold. If the football number were to drop from, I believe 75 is where people have it right about now, to 50%. If that was the way that they were going to cut this, it would go from, I believe, around 15.5 million to 10.25 million. And that's a significant decrease. There's no doubt about that. And especially with it being probably the biggest moneymaker in every single athletic department around the country, some people are not that happy, as you can probably imagine. There's definitely some infighting going on at a lot of different athletic departments with the NCAA, with a lot of different people. The Department of Education hasn't gotten involved, so there's a lot of different things to kind of unfold here, and definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch. Title IX is a very, very important thing when you talk about college athletics, but there definitely is an argument for football being the moneymaker in athletic departments and putting more money into that thing. Now, I do think there's a middle ground that could be found. If it's going from 75 to 65 or to 60, maybe that could be beneficial for everyone, but I do think there's going to be a huge fight between athletic departments, between the Department of Education, and between a lot of people inside athletic departments, a lot of coaches, a lot of players that will be battling back and forth about this issue, and I have to assume that football is going to win out because football's won out for quite some time around college sports, but who knows? Maybe some other people will get their way, and we'll see how that unfolds throughout the next little bit. Now we'll talk about the Xavier Lucas situation, Anthony, because this is a very interesting one. The Wisconsin defensive back, Xavier Lucas, kind of the center of a very interesting legal battle that could be happening pretty soon against Miami. He transferred to Miami this past week, and he transferred without entering the transfer portal. And the story goes that he wanted to enter the transfer portal, said to Wisconsin that he wanted to enter, and Wisconsin was not willing to put his name in the portal. Obviously, a very confusing situation. Sounds like Wisconsin is denying his request and saying that he signed a 2-year revenue sharing agreement in December 2nd that is binding. They also said that he signed something with the NIL collective that is binding. So they're battling back and forth. They're saying that Miami tampered with him. A lot of different things are going back and forth with this. The problem is NCAA bylaws do not necessarily mandate a player to enter the transfer portal before he goes to another school. That's going to be an issue as you go forward throughout the rest of this thing. That is going to create some lawsuits. Now, as Anthony was saying here, I don't think there's a lot here, if I'm being totally honest. From what I gather, there's really not a ton for Wisconsin to argue here, and I think they'll be quiet pretty quickly here. I don't necessarily think they're going to fight this one tooth and nail. I don't think they're going to go to the nth degree to make sure that Xavier Lucas and Miami pay for this one, because I don't think they have a great argument for this one. I think if they put his name in the portal the way that he asked, I think they would have been more than fine. Also, these revenue sharing agreements, the NIL agreements, are very, very hard to get a beat on right now. So it's very hard to know how binding those are. It's very hard to get an idea of, are those binding to the university? Are they just binding to the collective? And how does that work back and forth? So a lot of questions about this. The big issue here is him bypassing the portal, which obviously in this scenario with this kid, I don't necessarily have a problem with him doing that in that scenario, but definitely is a lot of questions about the next kid that wants to do that. Does he even tell his school that he wants to go into the portal? Does he just jump in and then go somewhere else? Or does he not jump in and just go somewhere else? So there's a lot of different questions about what's going to happen with the portal from this, and there's a lot of different questions about how long Wisconsin and Miami are going to battle over this, because this is definitely going to be a big-time question. And as you said, Anthony, Congress has a lot to do with this, so we'll find out when we find out type of thing. Obviously, the future of college football, a lot of it relies on those people up in Washington, D.C., and we'll see what happens with that. Definitely a lot of different questions, and this is going to be just the start, guys. This is going to be a very interesting thing to follow, and definitely will be something that will inform a lot of decisions as we move forward with this, regardless of what Wisconsin does going forward. So I don't think Wisconsin has much of an argument here. I think Wisconsin's probably going to bow out pretty quickly from this thing, but definitely will be an interesting thing to follow and how it informs some decisions down the stretch of the season next year or the year after that or even in spring of this year. So definitely will be an interesting thing to watch. Great player. He's getting kind of lost in all this. Really talented player and a great addition to that Miami team, but we'll see what happens in the next little bit. Then you did have some coaching carousel updates. You had Steve Sarkisian has been extended through 2031. Sounds like he turned down 2 different NFL interview requests, and Texas decided to come through and say, let's give you a little bit extra money. I don't know exactly what those numbers are, but they've moved forward. They added 2 more years to an already 5-year extension, got him locked up to 2031, and put them in a really good place. Obviously something that you very much want. That's a very good coach, and definitely something you want on the staff for a very long time. They also extended Brandon Harris, who is their who was their GM, and definitely a huge piece of what Texas has been over the last couple of years. A huge piece, and definitely someone you want to lock up for quite some time. A huge addition there, and definitely a guy that if Texas fans had it their way, he'd be around for as long as Steve Sarkisian is around. Then you did have USC was able to extend D'Anton Lynn, a huge thing for USC because he was getting a lot of interest from Penn State, from a couple of different jobs all the way out there, and it would be very interesting to talk about. And Anthony, that's actually a good idea. I'm going to do a segment on that, on what I would do if I was NCAA commissioner for a day. I'll break down a couple of the improvements, maybe later in the week. I'll do a full segment on that and break it all down. The first thing would be scheduling, and I'll talk about that in more detail when we do that, but appreciate that suggestion. Definitely something I want to do. And then Rob Ryan also added to that USC staff as a linebacker coach. Obviously a lot of experience in football, and will be very interesting to watch that unfold. A huge thing to keep D'Anton Lynn around, and added a lot of experience to that staff, no doubt about it. Then I do want to talk about Connor Hurley here for a second. He was in a single car accident, around 3 a.m. This past weekend, on Thursday actually this past week. He was taken to the hospital. It sounds like he is stable and resting right now. Obviously very good news, as good of news as we could hope for right now, but a very young kid, only 17 years old, hoping the best for him, obviously. Devastating for this young man, devastating for his future, remarkably bright future. Hopefully he can make a total recovery and find his way back onto the football field, because this is a very special kid. Obviously hoping for the best for him and his family right now. A very scary moment, no doubt about that, but he is resting, he is stable right about now, and we'll give you more news as we know it. This is about as good news as we could possibly have right about now. So hoping for the best going forward, and definitely a very scary moment, but really hoping that he finds his feet again and definitely finds his way back onto the football field, and hopefully back with his teammates very shortly. And then we got the national title. We'll just give some final words for the national title here. The end of the college football season is tonight. It's always kind of a bittersweet moment, one of the most memorable seasons of my entire lifetime. Probably my entire lifetime, if I'm being totally honest, point blank period, the most memorable. A lot of reason because of you guys. It's been incredible to kind of go through this with you guys, especially you, Anthony. It's been awesome to kind of interact with you throughout this, and it's been two teams that represent resilience, represent battling through adversity to get here, and just sit back, enjoy it. We'll talk about it all tomorrow. I can promise you that. We'll get into all of the craziness that will unfold, and definitely going to be a lot of different things that... Oh, yeah, absolutely. Definitely something I can do, talking about the freshman quarterbacks coming in, and we'll see what they can do in 2025. But overall, the game tonight, just enjoy it. You know, we can talk about 2025. We can talk about the spring. We can talk about everything. After this game unfolds, enjoy this one unfold, and definitely going to be an incredible one, and one I have to assume is going to be a little bit closer than the ones that we talked about earlier in the show. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people covering every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports, we've got you totally covered over here at GSMC. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow to review the national title that's going on tonight.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.